reprint of Almighty Fortress. I have to say, this game has been an emotional roller coaster for me. You've watched the playthrough. You'll see that. Give a little bit of my background there. Yay. My video is not zooming in on me as far as I can tell. And this is something I saw back around 86 for the first time. It was already, a fairly old game then. And I wanted it. I mean, subject matter, multiplayer, diplomacy, freewheeling, but, had this separate system for the religious conversion as well as military operations, economics. Didn't have much on politics. And in fact, it's a bit sparse on that period at the end. And I was aware back then when I decided I wanted it. The only thing it goes into any detail about really is the divorce question for Henry VIII. Now, I was told SPI, this is one of Rick Helly pointed this out. This is one of the couple of games that SPI didn't produce initially in-house. They bought it from someone else. The guy who originally designed it had designed it as a classroom game for like 30-something players with, all kinds of different states, kind of a perfect EU type of circumstance. And boy, is that interesting, right? I don't see spending, 8 hours or whatever of class time on this being terribly valuable. I don't think it would, but as a project type thing that was done outside of class, it would make more sense. But I don't think it's the same value as that amount of time in class. But still, it's a really intriguing idea that they took this and decided, well, nobody's ever going to have that many players, and pared it down, simplified it, perhaps, and tried to work it into something that would be more palatable to the gamer of its time. Still a tough sell. It's a 6-player game, no ifs, ands, and buts. There's no opportunity to limit the number of players, and it would be very difficult to do so. Even diplomacy allows you to play with less players. This, I just don't think you could. I mean, maybe some people have made some rules to reduce it, but anyway, when I first saw it, I said, wow, this is so much what I want. A lot of time passed. I got out of gaming, got back into gaming. Ran into Here I Stand, which credited this as, well, we tried mightily to make it work and do what we wanted, but couldn't do it. And so after many, many plays of this, we decided to design Here I Stand. And Here I Stand's a much, much better game overall. However, this still has a place, I think. Anyway, I muddled through the rules, which had a couple of things going against them. First of all, this is a reprint, and of course, Decision Games Excalibur managed to screw up most things that they do. Part 1, wow. You don't fuck with Redmond Simmons in graphics. Everybody who ever does it, it comes out looking so much worse. Oh, sure. There's, colored map and everything, but the original has a simplicity and Simonson can handle color. But what he could do with just the sort of brown tones that he had available for this was amazing. The counters that he had, the artwork for him, the texture, it was all fine. The artwork for him was essentially the same as for Conquistador. But compared to the kind of blocky drawings that of figures that are on this, it just doesn't compare at all. Rules layout, they did a horrible job. Build 3-column, probably took 8 pages or something. This is not a hard game. Bloats out to 30 pages of rule book and spread across. The font's not terrible, or the point size isn't terribly larger, but I have great difficulty assessing things like this. Excalibur also didn't incorporate any of the errata. Instead, they added their own mistakes. They screwed up a couple of things on the map. They screwed up some things on the player aid cards. And just overall, made a worse product. So if you are interested, don't get the new version. Buy the flat pack. You can probably get it for less than you can get the new version of this at this point. And it's well worth it. Okay, comparatively. Whether or not the game's worth it, let's talk a little bit about that. So anyway, after the disappointment of the version, they sure did make it uglier, okay, whatever. And harder to cope with. I decided to play the advanced game, and I come to some conclusions. And part of it is I'm approaching the game, hey, it's a war game, it should be a good simulation, right? Here I stand actually, maybe not a great simulation, but it captures the flavor very well. This kind of doesn't. This has crazy shit going on. It has an economic system that doesn't seem to model reality, which may be purely an advanced rule aspect. May be purely something SPI tacked on, rather than something that the original game had. I don't know enough about that original game that was looked at. Maybe some old person from SPI who was involved in this to some degree remembers that and can comment. That would be awesome. I doubt it though. I mean, there are people that have that knowledge, but they don't watch my videos usually, unless I'm doing their game. And even then, usually not. Anyway, the economic system isn't a good model. The military system isn't a good model of the military in the game, and in the era. And unfortunately, I was a little too much in that mindset. That wouldn't have affected me when I first saw this game. I would have thought, oh, cool, it's kind of like, Pax Britannica or a number of other multiplayer, very light war game-ish things. What I call wimp games, if you want to go look at that BGG list. That actually are kind of my favorite games in a lot of ways. And I think Here I Stand fits into that, even though it has this greater flavor to it. And a little bit more believable historical application. Well, I came to some conclusions about the economic system that were just bullshit. Kind of with I haven't really tried this out, but my projection is that there's no reason that anybody should do anything before at least the first half of the game, because they're going to spend so much money. Well, what I found out is, there is, the economics does put a major burden on the players. There's no question of that. And one which probably means that they want to delay a little bit at points in the game and stock up cash in a way that's completely unrealistic for the era, in order to launch their next war. And what it does that's kind of good is it puts a damper so the game's not constantly warfare, because the era was not constantly it wasn't one where every player was constantly at war, or every country was constantly at war. And I think it actually covers that kind of nicely, and it provides an interesting play space because of that. And then, as I played more and more and began to look at it more and more as kind of a Ameritrashy or a wimp game or something like that, I started to take an enjoyment. And as I started to actually be able to fight and move pieces and stuff, it was enjoyable. There are some big gotchas on it. One is the Lutherans start off capable of doing a lot and gathering a lot of victory points and banking them. They're not there forever, but it's hard to take them away. And if the other players don't concentrate on taking the Lutherans down and fighting against the Reformation to some degree, then they're likely going to have so many points banked away, and because they move last in each game turn, they're going to be able to really kind of have enough points that nobody can beat them without doing extraordinarily well. The Lutherans almost do extraordinarily well by default, and that's largely because nobody terribly wants to stop them. Nobody has any great goals inside of them except the papacy. The papacy is incredibly weak and incapable. At the beginning of the game, they don't have enough missionaries to halt the Lutheran expansion, and once they do, it's kind of a stalemate between the two. They might be able to take a couple areas away from the Lutherans, but they're not going to be able to move in deeply, and particularly they're not going to be able to contest areas that don't have cities because of the way the missionaries and combat units interrelate, unless someone is providing them with a military invasion to ride along on. And even if somebody does provide them with a military invasion, that's not enough. It has to happen at a point at which the Lutherans can't recover. And what is that point? Well, that point comes in a couple of places, really. One of it is at the very end of the game. If people concentrate on taking the Lutherans down, they could do a lot of damage to them. Another is people could try to take the Lutherans out of the game, which is just capture enough of their territory that they never have the military power to reassert themselves as a powerful religious force again. Might not be completely removing them from the game, but which isn't completely possible, but it's possible to take somebody and put them in a position where they really cannot recover. And they may not even be able to move pieces because they may not have any more on the board, or they may not have an economy which allows them to do anything ever again. So you can probably put them out of everyone's misery, and then everyone kind of has a fair chance except for them. That's not really appealing. The default situation is that people will be feathering their own nest and probably not concentrating enough on the Lutherans. So it's going to be very hard to take them down at the end of the game. And they're going to get so tied up in their own little squabbles and their own wars that they can't extricate themselves, which we definitely see with the Ottomans-Habsburg War, where the Ottomans really only have one person they can go after, which is the Habsburgs, for the most part, throughout the whole game. And that kind of means there's always going to be a conflict there. We did try to make an alliance at one point, or an agreement to try to move against the Lutherans, and it just didn't hold together. And that's kind of the problem is, because the diplomacy is so flexible, because basically you can say, as long as you were at war and moving all your pieces and everything and fighting and stuff, you can basically change your alliances every turn. If you're not constantly fighting, there is a significant cost to declaring war, which is your entirety of your income. Your entirety of your income is what you pay for doing any aggressive actions, though. So as long as you're doing one war, if you shift to the next war, you don't pay anything additional for that immediate shift. And you might be able to stock up some money by like setting up a defensive line or something in between, even in turns that you're at war. There might be turns where you don't spend your whole income. You only spend like a third of your income, which is what you spend if you move a piece. You could also do what I did and take fallow periods where you just don't do anything, and then you collect your whole income. And if you're in good condition, you can do that. Oh, what else sits as an issue? Well, obviously, the end of the game is this wild and woolly land grab, and that is just so ahistorical that it really kind of bugs me. But it's also kind of cool and fun and chaotic, and yeah. Let's take a look at some of the rule system. The movement in combat, very, very simple. This becomes kind of a geometric game. There are places where you can like pin things down and set things up so that you're not really able to lose stuff if you're careful in terms of how you set up your forces, because zones of control are pretty potent in it, and the movement rates are kind of limited, although the naval movement rates can be really kind of tricky. But there are times when you can look at things and say, this is a safe place I can pull your units out. Here's another unbalanced issue. The French. The French are the only person in the game who really can't build armies the same way other people can. It basically takes a couple armies to garrison a city. Paris has a 2-army limit to what can be in it, which means you can't build additional armies if it's under any kind of threat at all. And the French don't go very late in the turns. They can't move their units out. They go before their main opponent, or probable main opponent, which is England. England is probably focused on France the same way the Ottomans are focused on the Habsburgs. England's got a little bit more flexibility, but in general, the French can't kind of allow the English any chance at getting to Paris if it's empty. And if it's not empty, they can't build their troops, which kind of sucks. The religious subsystem, it's so much less interesting than the one in Here I Stand. You just move stacks of pieces, and in general you have 1-to-1 battles and you roll, and it's really kind of just a luck fest. Whoever wins that battle gets a slight advantage, puts some of the other guys' pieces away for a little while. Sometimes you can manage a 2-to-1 numerical advantage, and that's worth doing. It still doesn't guarantee you anything, though. It's still kind of a luck fest thing. The actual diplomatic rules, again, they're so flexible, and in the advanced game, no matter what, they're very flexible. In the advanced game, there's this kind of perverse incentive to roll one war into the next one because of the way the financing works, where, yeah, I did something aggressive this turn, I won a war, I've got to spin and declare war immediately so that I don't waste another turn's income on that action. There's not a whole hell of a lot of interesting stuff going on with the religious conversion side, especially in terms of players being able to just declare that like their religion has changed. EU has a lot more intriguing options for people like France and England to say, maybe I want to be a Protestant country by design, rather than England just falling into it. In this, there's not really an advantage to it, and except that you can loan money, but you pay a victory point cost, you pay an economic cost for it. It does take the Pope out of the equation, though. He won't be able to hurt you again once you've been excommunicated fully. The Henry VIII rules, I don't see much reason why they won't follow the more or less historical pattern. Henry will want to ask for a divorce. The Pope will definitely not want to grant it. And Henry will probably become a Protestant, will become excommunicated, and the Church of England forms, and he has no real interest in being particularly Lutheran, but he also doesn't, is no longer Catholic, so he becomes in this kind of limbo state. I'm not sure that there's a reason that there's this fairly detailed, probably one of the most detailed systems in the game, as detailed as any other system, basically, for handling the religious situation when, really, point-wise, there's almost no reason that you would do otherwise. That's possible. Diplomacy early in the game, there could be some reason the English want to make sure that they stay Catholic. if they do not take the advantage, they're the ones with the best opportunity to say, you know what, we can change this. I'll just remain Catholic. The papacy takes such a hit in victory points. Ooh, I forgot to do my penalty points. The scores that I came up with at the end of my game were actually wrong. Britain should have been 4 points less, which puts them only to 5. France should have been 2 points less. They're negative, I don't know what. More negative. But anyway, even more unbalanced in favor of the Lutherans than I saw. Not that that can't be overcome. It is a multiplayer game, and it's very freewheeling, and it's possible. The problem is the first impression is kind of like, wow, the Habsburgs are everywhere. We should beat them up. Yeah. Well, that's not really necessary. They need to hold everything they have and grow. And yes, they have a big income, which allows them to fight battles more. It allows them to do some other stuff, build troops more easily, etc. Because each fallow turn gives them a bigger chunk of change. But they kind of need it. They're everywhere. They're involved in their natural enemies are just about everyone. You know, at least at one level or another, just about everyone on the board has a claim on them, or they have a claim on that person. Anyway, where were we? I don't remember. Yeah, the scripting on the Henry VIII rules. You know, the English could decide that they want to remain Catholic. There's not a whole hell of a lot of an advantage to it. They'll basically pay, instead of a 4-point victory penalty, they'll pay a 10-point victory penalty. So they're paying an additional 6 points to remain Catholic. It reduces the Habsburg and French bonuses for going to war with the English. That might be a big deal. But on the other hand, they're probably going to want to go to war with someone. One of those two, at least. And just because they reduce the benefits on the other person doesn't mean the other person isn't as interested in wiping them off the board. Basically, if you have a real enemy, what you'd love to do is just knock them out. Take their capital and destroy all their troops, and they will never be able to rebuild troops as long as you can hold their capital and nobody frees it for them. So there's sort of a semi-player elimination. I mean, I'd have no problem with someone leaving the game if they no longer had pieces and couldn't play anymore. It would not be unreasonable to say, well, I don't think anybody's going to save your ass here out of altruism. But it wouldn't be impossible. There are situations where it might happen, but it would be so unlikely. I don't see any reason why it would. But anyway, it does, provide a framework that's kind of fun to play. It's almost like a fantasy game, though. It doesn't, in the sense that it just doesn't give you actions that are all that realistic, and that's with a lot of scripting on the Henry VIII and a fair number of little special rules. Not a huge amount, but the papacy has a limit to their income, which is basically what they make from the beginning of the game to the end, unless something terrible happens, like they get wiped out. They can't be converted. There are definitely rules to make things try to fall out kind of historically in certain aspects, but the actual flow of the play and the flavor is so loose and everything that it's about as historical as playing a game of diplomacy, or it really doesn't guide you terribly much. One of the interesting facets to the game is the idea of variable victory conditions. Not a lot of games have this kind of thing. Basically, many of the players have a random chance to have a random set of victory conditions. Now, the reason that they said that the design claims for this is so that nobody gets familiar with what the victory conditions are, so you can't calculate what other people have. That gives an impression that you should not look at the victory conditions? Well, not looking at the victory conditions will pretty much ensure the Lutherans a victory. Looking at the victory conditions probably doesn't cause much trouble. The variable victory conditions don't change the game terribly much. They kind of shift things a little bit. Generally, your enemies are going to be the people near you. You're going to have things that you want from them. They may just not be the things that everybody expects. The things that are most valued may not be the things that are expected. It's aspects like that. But largely, it's not going to change the flow of the game, and it's not really going to be a huge surprise as to, who's going to attack where and what, and aspects like that. So it's not like you're sitting on some hidden victory ideals, which I would really love. So like, the Henry VIII thing. It might be quite possible. Henry was a very interesting and conflicted person who believed very much in Catholicism and was very afraid of what it meant to be interdicted. And if your victory conditions leaned more in that direction than in what the game assumes, which is producing an heir is the most important thing, or if they leaned towards more of I really want to seize those monasteries. I want that cash. That would be really cool. And that's not even in the game, actually. There's no income bonus for Henry. Or no cash windfall, nothing for Henry choosing the route that he did, and there really was for England. But anyway, if you had that kind of victory condition in there where nobody really knows what you're going after, that makes negotiation a little bit more interesting in some cases. Of course, a game in which one person wins and beats everyone else isn't the best environment for trying to model these kind of things, right? So, in England, which keeps all of its territory and takes out Scotland, and that's all it does, has won, right? Whether or not somebody else has won more shouldn't matter too much to the players, but it always does in a game. And that's one of the problems with any kind of model, is that you either have to put such restrictions on them to try to harness how they play to prevent their activities from going into the unbelievable historical type situation, or you have to break that paradigm of I know that there's one person who's going to win this game, and I have to check that person, and I have to make sure the leader doesn't, I have to make sure that if somebody looks like they're the leader, that I take them down. And that aspect gets used in, say, the Coin series in a way that feels a little bit more believable in general. But in a lot of these more traditional designs, including Here I Stand with the CDG, you start seeing alliances to bring someone down because their victory points are higher. Their natural desires, which may not be threatening Europe, right, are threatening the other players because everybody's trying to be the one person who wins the most or whatever. And that affects me too, so I mean, it's not. Anyway, it's an interesting one. I think it's worth having still. Even though I went through an existential crisis about it, basically. I would definitely suggest getting the original version, unless you're finding this thing for like $5, $10, whatever. $10, probably not. It probably still better get the original. One thing I didn't talk about, the components. Not just the components for this, but for the original. They're sadly lacking. You've got this pile of player aids, and that was a big deal when it came out because most of the SPI games didn't have a lot of extra player aid cards or whatever, but they were fairly small. I think they were like 2 pages worth of player aids that were kind of on a thin stock that you could tear apart, if I recall correctly. Now they're each on a glossy piece of stock. And for the Habsburgs, completely fucked up. They made setup and everything. You're going to have to, if you get this version, you're going to have to go online. No matter which version you're going to get, you're going to need the errata. If you get this version, you're going to have to go online and correct some things that are on that glossy paper that, of course, will smear if you use a normal pen on it. But anyway, the components aren't enough to support the play of the game properly. You're supposed to write down, but there's some BGG player aids that you can keep track of stuff, but they're fucked up too. You'd want to redo them. But you have to write down what things. You have to write down your income total, although you could recount that extra. Mine probably diverted and got screwed up. But you have to write down your total cash on hand. You have to write down who controls each area and what religion each area is. Well, that's ridiculous, okay? Especially since there's no player aids to help you manage that. So I had to introduce little flag markers from EU, which is going overboard. You know, some colored counters of the right color would work fine for control of things. I had to introduce little tokens to indicate things were Lutheran or not, which doesn't work. I used Tiddlywinks, which doesn't work where things are really the most, where the religious war is the most of in play, which was in Germany itself. There's just too many little one hex spaces that need to be controlled. There's a lot in Italy too, but that's a little less valuable. Nobody's terribly interested in converting most of Italy. Switzerland they are. There just are not the components. And I used poker chips for cash on hand. I still wrote down the income because, you know, what can you do? You know, there's no track to keep track of it on or anything like that. So keeping track of it on paper worked, but I had to keep erasing the values because they change constantly. Anyway, the components do not support a comfortable play of the game. It's not terribly hard to come up with components that'll help you or player aids that'll help you handle it, although the German situation is rather tight and difficult to see. And the thing is, without the things being on the board, it's very hard to assess what's going on, what the game state is. And that, you know, if you're having to look at a piece of paper, especially if it's one that everybody's sharing because it's the definitive, you know, standard of what the situation is instead of being on the board where everybody can see it, that's going to get really, really troublesome. In solo, the game's not meant for solo, obviously. Pawing through all those different player aids was hard. The fact that they were 3 times the size of the SPI ones didn't make it any easier, but you know, I've got a lot of table space. There's not a lot of game here in terms of board stuff, but between all the things I had to write on and the chips and everything else, it took up a lot of space. Anyway, I still think it's interesting. I'm not anywhere near as disappointed as I thought I was. Maybe halfway through the game before I started moving pieces. But it does not have to be played the way I did. In fact, I think you've got advantages to actually taking some early actions, which I went into a couple of times during the playthrough. Sum this up. Hey!